Hanyu, an elegy for stone drums. Shang-Ji held a rubbing from the stone drums in his hand and urged me to write an elegy for the drums. Du Fu is no more among us. Li Bai is dead. What can a modest talent like mine say about these famous drums? When Zhou rule was collapsing and the whole world boiled, King Xuan rose in anger and his lance shook the world. He opened wide the bright hall to the tribute of nations, and so many lords came, their swords and girdle stones clashed together. To show his might, the king held a hunt on Mount Chi's southern slope. Every beast and bird for 1,000 miles was driven into his nets. To engrave a record of his achievement that would last 10,000 ages, they hewed stone into drums that were polished smooth. His retainers were the finest scholars of their age. Their best poems were chosen, carved on the drums, and left on the mountain. Rain scoured them, the sun baked them, wildfires burned them. But spirits kept watch and protected them all these years. "Sir, where did you get this paper rubbing?" I asked him. So perfect, so true to each carved line and word. Such austere phrases, their meanings obscure and difficult to read, the characters neither scribal hand nor tadpole style. After so many years, how have they not worn away? The strokes are still vigorous, quick swords severing an alligator, a phoenix dancing in the sky, a flock of immortals flying by, or trees of lapis and coral with branches intertwined, golden cords and iron hawsers tightly bound, or an ancient ruler's cauldron sunk in the river, or a dragon soaring on high. The mediocre scholars who compiled the odes did not include them. Their compass was too narrowly defined. Confucius travelled west, but not as far as Qin, so his collection, the odes, included the stars but ignored these, the sun and moon. I love these antiques so much. Why was I born too late? Tears flow down my cheeks as I reach out to them. I remember I'd just won the highest degree. It was the first year of the Yuan He reign. An old friend was serving in the army at Fengxiang. He helped me devise a plan to rescue the stone drums. I purified myself and in clean cap and robes approached the chancellor and said, "How few such precious things have been preserved. They should be carefully wrapped in rags and mats. Just a few camels could carry 10 drums here." Like the ritual cauldron of Gao, now in the temple of Confucius, their value would increase beyond all measure. If by the emperor's grace they were to rest at the National College, the students there could study them and thereby refine their learning. When the hand carved the classics on stone, scholars filled their gates. So now the learned of the empire would all flock here to see them. We would scrape off the moss to expose the intricate carving, then lay them in a suitable spot on level ground. Sheltered in a great hall with overhanging eaves, they would be safe forever from further harm. The chancellor had served long by wisely avoiding decisions. Though he may have been moved, in the end he did nothing. So shepherds still use them to strike fire, cattle to wet their horns. Who is left to care for them with honor and respect? Every day, every month, they decay as the earth reclaims them. These 6 years I have looked westward, helpless and sorry. Wang Shiji's calligraphy, even tossed off, was beautiful, but a few sheets could be had for the price of a goose. These drums survived the wars of 8 dynasties. What sense is there in neglecting them today? The wars have ended, and the world is at peace. Talented scholars are honored, Confucius and Mencius respected. How is it, with such learned men in office, that I can't persuade them, my voice grown weak? So I end my elegy for these great stone drums with a cry of despair at my utter failure. So here we get quite a long poem. It's not the longest. Very soon we will read also in this section of heptasyllabic gushi the two poems included by Bai Juji, and they're enormously long. I think I'll have to cut their videos into two at least. But this is quite a long poem, and as opposed to the other Hanyu poems, this is based on a personal event that Hanyu experienced, and about an object or series of objects that we will talk about in a minute. But more than the previous poems, it's a poem that's very historically located. It talks about old artifacts. It talks about historical periods and writers of different times and ages. So this is a poem that I enjoy it a lot because I'm a person of an antiquarian and neoclassicist mindset. But it's a poem that requires a lot of commentary and a lot of explanation to make it easily intelligible. So first of all, this is an elegy about the stone drums. Now, the poem itself tries to explain what these stone drums were, although Hanyu didn't have the accurate historical information about them, it seems. Now, these stone drums, which still exist, they're kept right now in the Palace Museum in Beijing, were a set of 10 stone drums, so rocks hewn in the shape of like the instruments, the musical drums. And they had inscriptions on them, basically poems. Now, these stone drums are the oldest extant stone inscriptions in China. Not the oldest writing, because we have previous inscriptions, basically in bone, oracle bone inscriptions, and also probably in metal. But they're the oldest stone inscriptions in China. They were in the region of Qin, in the northwest of the empire, and today it is believed that they were produced during the Qin dynasty, or at least during the time of the Kingdom of Qin in the late Warring States period. In this poem, Hanyu mistakenly believes they were created about 500 years before that time, well, maybe less than 500, but in the Western Zhou dynasty under King Xuan. I don't know where he got this story, but anyway, it's an interesting reference that we will comment, because King Xuan is in many ways a parallel figure to the emperor of the Yuan-He reign under whom Hanyu served. They're both restorers of a declining dynasty's power and strength, and that's very significant also to explain Hanyu himself and his life, his policies, his cultural and political objectives. So this is an elegy for these objects. Summarizing the poem very briefly, there are these objects, these stone drums that are exposed to the winds in the region in which they were carved. Hanyu and others greatly appreciate them. A friend has brought some rubbings. This was a very typical thing that Chinese did on old stone inscriptions or on metal inscriptions. They put a piece of paper on top and rubbed with a piece of charcoal to get an inscription on the paper of the content of the original stone or metal inscription. So Zhangji, who is a poet and a friend of Hanyu, gives him or shows him one of these rubbings and asks him to make a poem commemorating these wonderful constructions, these wonderful human artifacts from the antiquarian and remote past. So Hanyu does just that. He makes a poem. In the first section of the poem, he introduces the context, which I have just explained, a friend coming with a rubbing and asking him to write. In the second part of the poem, he explains what he believes is the history behind the creation of this work of art, of these works of art. In the next section, he tells of how, when he was relatively younger than now, than at the time the poem was composed, this poem, he had already tried to get the chancellor and the government to protect these pieces of Chinese heritage by bringing them into the capital and protecting them in a building or perhaps at the university, and had been unsuccessful at persuading the chancellor. And finally, he concludes with a melancholy lament at the fact that the passage of time and the weather and other hardships will chip and continue chipping and destroying these monuments, this wonderful calligraphy from the past. Okay, so great poem. I enjoyed it a lot, but as I've just said before, I'm of an antiquarian mentality. Han Yu, we've already explained, was a key intellectual figure in the mid-Han period. In the mid-Han period, especially under the reign of the Yuanhe emperor, the empire, which had just survived the An-Lushan rebellion, was able to stage a little bit of a comeback. The emperor of the Yuanhe era, was Xiangzong, was able to restore part of the imperial power, to subdue some of the rebellious military commanders of the east and north. Unfortunately, his reformation and his attempts at putting the dynasty back on a firm track were destroyed by his assassination in 820, and after that begins the late Tang period, which was a period of mainly decline for the rest of the century, of infighting, rebellions, eunuch control of the court, famines, and so on and so forth. So this was the last time at which the reform and the restoration of the dynasty was believed possible. And Han Yu was one of the intellectuals, was one of the main intellectual backbones of this Tang restoration. He was a lover of the past, and in fact, he defended basically through his prose writing what he called Gu Wen, the old style of writing. He was a person in love with the past, but especially with the remote past, which he believed held the ideal models of not only of writing, but also of organizing society and of social relations and so on and so forth. So in this elegy for an object of the past, we have an elegy of Han Yu for the intellectual developments of the past, especially the classical Chinese tradition and past, basically the Confucian tradition of the Western and Eastern Zhou dynasty, of which he becomes a restorer of sorts, basically defending a restoration of the writing style that was made then, and also of the values. Han Yu was a precursor of Neo-Confucianism, of the new religious trends that would become official during the next dynasty, during the Sung, and which was a new religion, if you will, which was basically the state orthodoxy based on a rereading of Confucian classical texts and on a certain implicit hostility towards what had been the other big religious traditions of China until then, that is the Taoist and the Buddhist. Okay, so after this very, very long presentation, we can start talking about the poem bit by bit. So the main topic is, very transparently, an elegy, a commemoration of these wonderful stone artifacts from the past and their inscriptions, their calligraphy, which are not being preserved and valued as they should. As a sub-theme, a homage to this glorious past of Emperor Xuan when these inscriptions were made, and an evocation of other instances in which the words of the past, the words of the classics, were protected and were preserved by imperial patronage. Implicitly, in the comparison or in the connection between King Xuan and the Yuanhe reign, there is also a narration, a depiction, an implicit depiction of the current age as an age like King Xuan's age, an age of restoration of a dynasty that is experiencing hard times. An intense love for the past and for any artifact from the past, and a melancholy at the passage of time and at the disappearance of the objects from the past is also an important topic in this poem. So let's go couplet by couplet. Zhang Ji held a rubbing from the stone drums in his hand and urged me to write an elegy for the drums. As I said, Zhang Ji is an important mid-Tang poet. He was a friend of Han Yu, and he was, one of the interesting intellectual figures of the mid-Tang period, which is basically the first half, the last years of the 8th century and the early years of the 9th. And he was especially good at ballads in the Juefu style, at depicting the suffering of the people. So this friend of Han Yu comes with a rubbing of the stone drum's inscription and says, hey, write an elegy. Come on. Dufu is no more among us. Li Bai is dead. What can a modest talent like mine say about these famous drums? So here we have the typical Chinese, classical Chinese deprecation of the individual. So Han Yu was a very good writer. But we can take him at his word when he says that, okay, I'm not a Du Fu or a Li Bai, but I'll do my best. Interesting. Han Yu came only a few years after Li Bai and Du Fu, hardly a generation after them. And I wasn't aware, especially of Du Fu, that he was very appreciated in his own time. Li Bai was. I mean, this poem is probably one of the first texts, I imagine, that really started to canonize Du Fu as a genius at the same level as Li Bai, perhaps. I don't know. So these two couplets introduce us the topic, as we said before. So this friend brings me the rubbings. He tells me, hey, write a poem about this. And Han Yu says, I'm not one of these great poets of the very recent past, but I'll do my best. Now begins the main section, which describes the supposed history of these stone drums. When Zhou rule was collapsing and the whole world boiled, King Xuan rose in anger, and his lance shook the world. Now, the Zhou dynasty was a very long-lasting dynasty just before the imperial age, so its rulers were not called emperors, they were called kings, Wang. It's divided into two periods, the Western Zhou from about 1000 BC to 770, Eastern Zhou 770 to about 280. And the first was a period of relative splendor and expansion. The second was a period of decadence when the kings were powerless and the feudal lords were the ones in power. But even in the Western Zhou, in the first period, in the last years, there was a perceived decline in the power of the kings. One of the last kings that was able to do some reforms around the year 800, or probably a bit later, around the year 800 before Christ, was King Xuan. So he was seen in later Chinese historiography as a restorer, a person who was able to raise again the possibilities, the splendor, the strength of a declining royal house. So at the time of King Xuan is placed this creation of the drums. First, it's just mentioned that this King Xuan, when the Zhou dynasty was declining, restored it to military success and strength. He opened wide the bright hall to the tribute of nations, and so many lords came, their swords and girdle stones clashed together. So he was militarily successful, and in the temple in his capital, he brought all those people to submit to his royal rule. To show his might, the king held a hand on Mount Chi's southern slope. Every beast and bird for 1,000 miles was driven into his nets. So to commemorate his triumphs, he makes a hand close to the capital area. To engrave a record of his achievement that would last 10,000 ages, they hewed stone into drums that were polished smooth. So the hunt and the celebration is not enough. Like many rulers, King Xuan wants his success to be remembered, so he decides to have some stone drums cut, polished, and inscriptions made upon them. The inscriptions come now, or the information about the inscriptions. His retainers were the finest scholars of their age. Their best poems were chosen, carved on the drums, and left on the mountain. So the best writers write those poems on the drums. As I said before, we know today that these drums were not probably hewn at the time of King Xuan. They were much later. But the poems were difficult to read because they were in a complex calligraphy and using weird characters from the point of view of later dynasties. But what could be read in them, it's basically poems that commemorate royal hands and episodes like that. Some of them are similar to the poems, in fact, in tetrasyllabic verse that appear in the Book of Odes, the Shi Jing. But more about that later, because Han Yu is going to mention the Shi Jing. What happens with these inscriptions, with these wonderful poems inscribed on them, with these stone drums? Rain scored them, the sun baked them, wildfires burned them, but spirits kept watch and protected them all these years. So these are in nature, these inscriptions, they suffer from adverse climatological effects, but they have a numen. Some gods or spirits protect this wonderful document of the past from the weather and the attacks of time. Sir, so now in the following couplet, Han Yu seems to speak directly to Zhang Ji again. Go back to the topic of, hey, you've brought me a rubbing with the inscriptions of the stone drums. Sir, where did you get this paper rubbing? I asked him. So perfect, so true to each carved line and word. Such austere phrases, their meanings obscure and difficult to read, the characters neither scribal hand nor tadpole style. Now, we're not going to talk about the history of Chinese calligraphy, that would take us forever, but after the imperial period, a new style of calligraphy, before the imperial period, calligraphy writing in China differed a lot from region to region. The imperial unification under the Qin and then under the Han created a standard script, which is just mentioned here, the scribal hand, the Li Shu. And there were scripts from before which had fancy names, like the seal script for the script of the Qin dynasty, the Great Seal script for many of the scripts from before the unification. The tadpole style is one of those. Anyway, the idea here is that Han Yu can't understand most of the characters that appear in this inscription. In fact, he is going now to make a wonderful series of descriptions and comparisons of how they look, which probably hides the fact that he couldn't read most of them. So, after so many years, how have they not worn away? The strokes are still vigorous, quick swords severing an alligator, a phoenix dancing in the sky, a flock of immortals flying by, or trees of lapis and coral with branches intertwined, golden cords and iron horses tightly bound, or an ancient ruler's cauldron sunk in the river, or a dragon soaring on high. So we get, as I just said, a series of very visual, very seductive, very rhetorically powered and infused images on what this calligraphy, on what these inscriptions, on what the characters look like. And, the emphasis is on beautiful images, but also images of moving and curving. Yeah. So like swords severing the alligator, so they're strong characters, firmly marked, like phoenixes, immortals, like trees covered with jewels, like gold and iron filaments, like dragons flying or cauldrons sinking. So a whole set of beautiful images that act as an ekphrastic description of these characters, if you will. So after the description, we get back to the presumed historical background of this of these inscriptions. They were supposed to be inscriptions from the Western Zhou period. And in the classical period, in the Tang dynasty, most of the poetry that was preserved from the Zhou period was in a collection which had been canonized as a classic, the Classic of Odes, the Book of Odes, the Shi Jing. Now, that classic did not include these poems, and that is what Han Yu is going to talk about now. He's so hyperbolically praising these inscriptions that he says they weren't included in the Book of Odes, and they should have, because they're even better than the poems in the Book of Odes. Let's read. The mediocre scholars who compiled the Odes did not include them. Their compass was too narrowly defined. Confucius traveled west, but not as far as Qin, so his collection, the Odes, included the stars but ignored these, the sun and the moon. So this is a rather shocking image if you've read classical Chinese poetry, because, Han Yu is disparaging Confucius and the compilers of the Odes, which would have been almost sacred people for the classical Chinese. Probably he's being a bit hyperbolic, but, he might have felt a little bit of this in his intense love for the recovery of a long-lost series of inscriptions and poems in these ancient artifacts, in these stone drums. So he's basically saying, these poems are the sun and the moon. The Odes, which are a classic, which are a sacred text, memorized and recited by anybody who wants to be anything under the Tang dynasty, these poems, compared to the ones in the stone drums, are, not that very important. And even Confucius, the sage, the wisest of all men, didn't compile them, didn't include them in his selection for the Book of Odes, because he didn't travel far to the west. The old capital of the Western Zhou dynasty, where the drums were, or where the drums were supposed to have been created, was the same as the territory of the feudal state of Qin in the extreme west of China. I love these antiques so much. Why was I born too late? Tears flow down my cheeks as I reach out to them. So he's reaching out to the rubbings, not to the drums themselves. And, this couplet very, very, very effectively pictures Han Yu's mind and all his intellectual and political project. He was a restorationist, a conservative in a way, but a radical conservative, if you get what I mean. He wanted to go back to the idealized past, use it as a template for reforming the present. He defended strong imperial government as he believed had existed in the early Western Zhou dynasty. He defended the writing style of that period as opposed to the weak, effeminate Pian Wen parallel prose of his own time. He's a lover of the past. And also a real conservative is a person that not only loves what the past has created, but that preserves what might be preserved, what might still be renewed and made useful, tries to keep the tradition alive by renewing the objects of the past with a practical value and intent in the present. Okay, so here finishes the second section in which we had the background of these drums, and now we get a previous episode of Han Yu's life when he personally tried to protect them, long before this moment that he was talking about now when the rubbings were brought to him. When he had just passed his examinations to become a civil servant, then he had already tried to push for preservation for these stone drums. I remember I just won the highest degree. It was the first year of the Yuan He reign. So he had passed the examinations. He was number one. So, he's, ruffling his feathers a little bit. Like, I was number one in the examination, which was an extremely hard examination to become a civil servant. And it was the beginning of the Yuan He era. As I said, this was, I think, around the year 800, from 800 to 820, the period of the restoration, the main period of restoration of the Tang dynasty's powers under the relatively able and wise emperor Shenzong. And Han Yu was part, politically and intellectually, of this restorationist project. So at the time he had just begun, it was the first year, after all, of the Yuan He reign. An old friend was serving in the army at Fengxiang. He helped me devise a plan to rescue the stone drums. So, quite explicit. Fengxiang was in the northwest, in the area of the old state of Qin. I purified myself, and in clean cap and robes approached the chancellor and said, "How few such precious things have been preserved. They should be carefully wrapped in rugs and mats. Just a few camels could carry 10 drums here." So he came with a proposal to the chancellor. He said, okay, we have these wonderful objects from the past over there, not far from the capital, from Chang'an, in Fengxiang. They are a relic from the past. It's not that expensive to bring them here. We should bring them here. In the next couplets, he's going to explain why. What is their value and what would be the effect of bringing them here. Now he has emphasized the feasibility and the relatively small cost of doing so. Like the ritual cauldron of Gao, now in the temple of Confucius, their value would increase beyond all measure. So being here, their value would increase. They are a wonderful work of art. They should be placed in a sacred, in a nice place where they will be respected and valued as they deserve. A mention is made to a cauldron of Gao. I don't know what this is, but probably it's one of the old cauldrons or pieces of bronzeware that had been made in the Western Zhou and that were collected and treasured in later historical periods. If, by the Emperor's grace, they were to rest at the National College, the students there could study them and thereby refine their learning. When the Han carved the classics on stone, scholars filled their gates. So now the learned of the empire would all flock here to see them. So this is referencing certain periods, especially a period in the past. So at the capital was the National University, the Daishui, and people studied there. And Han Yu proposes putting them there and evokes a precedent. During the Han Dynasty, which was more than 600 years before Han Yu's time, in the Eastern Han Dynasty, the classics, including the Book of Odes that I've just mentioned and a few others, had been canonized. And during the Eastern Han, stone inscriptions were made of these classics and placed at the National University so that all the students could just put a piece of paper on top of the inscriptions and rub and get a good canonical official version of the classics. So he's saying these stone drums are like those classics. And like the Han Dynasty had built these stone inscriptions to further scholarship, so should we bring these stone drums here. And like scholars under the Han all came to the university building to get their own copy of the classics, so now probably all people in this cultured age will come to get their own copy of these wonderful poems from the past by getting a rubbing. Okay, so what if this happened? What would we do with these wonderful relics of the past? We would scrape off the moss to expose the intricate carving, then lay them in a suitable spot on level ground, sheltered in a great hall with overhanging eaves. They would be safe forever from further harm. So with this finishes the proposal, probably an almost verbatim adaptation of what Han Yu had told the Chancellor of his proposal on looking after these pieces of material heritage. But what happens? The Chancellor is not too keen. The Chancellor had served long by wisely avoiding decisions. Though he may have been moved, in the end he did nothing. So why the strong political criticism on the Chancellor? Although, after all, the Chancellor rejected his proposal, and Han Yu was a bold man in his speech. After all, he got almost killed and certainly exiled for basically writing a memorial to the emperor where he said that the emperor was doing a stupid thing by worshipping a bone of the Buddha and that his life would be shortened as a consequence, perhaps. So what happens, therefore? The memorial, the proposal made to the Chancellor was not heeded, so these monuments have to languish, still outside, subjected to the climatic attacks of rain, of fire, of the passage of time. Yeah. So shepherds still use them to strike fire, cattle to wet their horns. Who is left to care for them with honor and respect? So evidently, they are going to be exposed and they're probably going to be ruined, much to the pain of Han Yu. The last section presents this sad, this melancholy situation in which this treasure from the past is going to probably little by little disappear. Every day, every month, they decay as the earth reclaims them. These 6 years, I have looked westward, helpless and sorry. So this gives us the time frame. It's 6 years since the beginning of the Yuan He era then. We're in the 7th year of the Yuan He era. And 6 years have passed since Han Yu presented this proposal to the Chancellor. Wang Shiji's calligraphy, even tossed off, was beautiful. But a few sheets could be had for the price of a goose. These drums survived the wars of 8 dynasties. What sense is there in neglecting them today? So now he makes a comparison. On the one hand, he mentions Wang Shiji. He was a painter and writer, well, more a writer than a painter, sorry. A writer and a member of the aristocracy during the period of disunion, and his free-flowing, spontaneous calligraphic style was taken as, the best of the best, and he is historically considered by many the best calligrapher in all Chinese history. So he mentions, this calligraphy of Wang Shiji, even the bad one, was quite good, and you could buy it easily. So even though it was such a great calligraphy out of a great artist. But these drums, which are perhaps maybe not better calligraphy, but they've survived 8 dynasties. The period after the fall of the Han Dynasty was very chaotic, and there were lots of small dynasties. So these drums that are history, that are thousands perhaps of years old by the reckoning of Han Yu at this time, they are being neglected unfairly. People pay a goose for some writings of, or used to pay with geese for some few sheets of writing from Wang Shiji. Nobody is paying anything for this marvelous token of the past. The wars have ended, and the world is at peace. Talented scholars are honored, Confucius and Mencius respected. So now, in a time, it would be imaginable that in a time of chaos or war, no attention might be available for occupying oneself with culture, the fine arts, and with these relics from the past. But now we're at peace, and Confucian scholarship reigns supreme with the patronage of the court. How is it, with such learned men in office, that I can't persuade them, my voice grown weak? So I end my elegy for these great stone drums, with a cry of despair at my utter failure. So the poem ends on a sad, on a melancholy note. The poet hasn't been able to guarantee the survival, the preservation of this monument of the past. But even if the inscriptions, as far as I know, persist in rubbings from the next dynasty, from the Song dynasty, which has preserved most of the characters and therefore most of the poems of the 10 drums. The 10 drums still exist today, but the ravages of time have left them with only about 200 characters that are still readable on the drums themselves. But thanks to those rubbings, like the ones that appear in this poem, and thanks to Han Yu's words, those objects of the past and the words that they contained live on and live until the present.